So we've had some car launches, and we thought that we would have a little run through four of the cars, uh, and have a little chat about the cars, the teams, and how we think they're going to do this season. And I think this season is actually really important. I think all of these car launches are really, really important because um, I guess the way I look at this is 2024 is the last time we're going to get a big update for each of these cars for this rule set, because last next year 2025 will be the last season of this rule set. So you'd imagine that all of these guys are going to lock in these designs for 2 years. So what we see this year is going to be very similar to what we see next year, because they're all going to be gearing up for 2026. So I think that makes this season's car launch season particularly important. Um, so we're going to have a go at breaking some of these guys down, and let's go. Let's see what we've got. So the first team I thought we could talk about was McLaren. McLaren launched the MCL 38 this week. They did some renders. They did a live event, and we got a little look at the car. I just want to start first with the aims that McLaren might have for this season. So McLaren ended last season really well. They were probably on pace the second quickest car to Red Bull across the final third of the season, which is huge considering where they started the season. So what are their aims for 2024? I think they need to demonstrate that the trajectory of the second half of last year can be sustained, and given that that trajectory was based on a new structure, both in terms of hardware, so they've got a new driver and loop simulator, they've got a brand spanking new wind tunnel, but also from a personnel point of view, they've got their three technical heads, and now they've got David Sanchez and Rob Marshall in there as well. They need to demonstrate that that is going to work. That's important not just to McLaren, it's important to me because, as we've said before, there has to be a model where Adrian Newey's singular genius is able to be distilled into more than one person, because that one person doesn't exist in any way, shape, or form anymore. So McLaren are giving us a way to do that, and it'll be interesting to see whether this format for McLaren works. And in terms of the car itself, I think they need to know that the car is responsive to upgrades and that there's a good correlation with the new wind tunnel. And we're not really going to know that until they hit the track, but that's what they need to do. And I think they probably need to improve the drivability of the car as well. Lando was talking about the fact that even at the end of the season last season, although the car was performing well, he still wasn't particularly comfortable driving it. He talked about having to alter his driving style to fit with the car, and not really being able to drive it the way he wanted to. So that's where I think that those are the things that I think McLaren need to do. I'm going to come to you, Ammar. What did you think of the car when you looked at it? What did you think of the launch, the livery, the overall appearance?
Yeah,
Any thoughts?
I think the MCL 38 does look really good. I think that with everything that you said about the technical additions, and just sort of looking at the car, the ability for it to respond to upgrades, drivability. I think, yeah, you said it right. The drivability thing was the biggest thing that we had heard across the board towards last season, right? But McLaren did show a lot of promise, right? After a torrid start to the season last year, they came on much better than anyone else. And in fact, we've talked about how they seem like they are primely positioned to build on what they did last year and really be at it with Red Bull. And some of the rhetoric, some of the talk coming out of McLaren has been that they can see themselves challenging for Red Bull. Of course, everyone thinks that, but they have shown, right? I mean, the Qatar sprint was one example of that. There were other times throughout the year, even at Silverstone for a few laps, at least initially, and perhaps in the right conditions, with a little bit of help of the weather or whatnot, they might be right there with Red Bull. So I
Yeah.
think that this would be my team, and this particular car would be one I would have the biggest hope with, given what we've seen they do last year. and then really, added everything in there. The launch itself was great, but I think the potential really lies in the car, and we'll see it when it hits the track in Bahrain. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is one of the most important car launches we're seeing this season, which is why we're talking about it, because they have the potential to be absolutely right up there, really snapping at Red Bull's heels. And Red Bull probably need to be worried about what McLaren have come up with. In terms of what they showed, McLaren didn't really show very much, and actually both the renders and the photos of the car, they shadowed out quite a lot of important things. For me, that tells you quite a lot. So Andrea Stella, he was quoted at the launch as saying, and I'll read out the quote. He said, "There are a number of innovations on the car, but not all of the areas we wanted to address have been completed for our launch spec car. And those areas now become the focus of our in-season development." That tells me two things. Now you can take that as, again, McLaren aren't ready and they haven't been able to reach their targets. But I would take that slightly differently. I would think that there's a bit of a confidence in the team that they don't want to release some of the stuff that they've got in their car because they know that it's performance enhancing, right? They've got stuff on their car that's innovative, that they are proud of, and they are confident is going to make their car faster than their competition. So for me, that speaks of some confidence within the camp, but also the idea that this isn't you bring your car to the launch and that's it. Your car needs to be able to respond to upgrades. It's what sunk Aston Martin last season, that they had a car that started off really well, but they didn't understand how to bring performance to it, and they dropped off because their upgrades didn't do anything. And in fact, they took the car backwards. So it's good news for McLaren, and it's big talk from them if they are saying that they've got a launch spec, but they've also got potential for upgrades. That will also give us an idea of how good their correlation is between their new wind tunnel and the track. Go on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I agree with you. I was going to say that we've always seen a little bit of sportsmanship with these car launches, right? There often is a little bit hidden. There's a lot that has not been brought to the fore yet. There's a lot of cat and mouse games with these things, if you will. And I think the McLaren project is so interesting, right? Not only because they brought who they brought in from Red Bull, right? And we've talked about this in the past, but in reality, if you look around the grid, right, they're the only ones that are well positioned to beat Red Bull, not just based on what they did last year, but you look at where Mercedes and Ferrari are. They're in a sort of a transitionary period with the Lewis Hamilton news, and there's going to be some impact of that. It's hard to estimate what that would look like, but naturally, you have two drivers going out into their last season, right? There's an impact of that. The development pace might not be what it might be if you have those drivers locked up for the foreseeable future, all of which McLaren really has, right? And then on top of it, they appear to have a structure with Zach Brown at the helm. The three guys that we've talked about going after Adrian Newey, they have a lot of what appears to be Red Bull's concepts, and they probably know a little bit about where Adrian was going with the car, at least as of a few months ago.
I mean, some of it is quite interesting though. So what they did, what you could see that we're gonna talk about side pods, I'm sure, for the rest of this video, but. They've actually done what Red Bull did, and they obviously came up with this themselves. They last season they were following Red Bull's philosophy with that underbite, overbite, with the bottom lip of the side pod protruding, and then a small letterbox aperture. And what they've done now is flip that on its head, and we're going to talk about what Red Bull have done shortly. But they've gone for the overbite. So now you've got the side impact structure on the side of the car, we think incorporated into the side pod structure in the same way that Mercedes had been doing for the past 2 seasons. It's interesting that happens. That's quite a cool little innovation that they've got there. And there's a few other bits and pieces going backwards towards the rear of the car. But I mean, I go back to the fact that they really haven't shown us very much of the properly performance enhancing areas of the car. And it's a stark difference from last season, where they were happy to show us everything and be very clear that we haven't hit our targets. We think our car's going to do badly, and then it did. But this year they've clearly got something to hide, and that shows an inner confidence in the team that I'm excited to see translate into something on the track.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to see what testing looks like, and then of course what that first race will bring. It'll tell us a lot. And no, I'm not expecting them to beat Red Bull out of the gate, but I'm really looking to see them be right there. And of course, with the first couple of races in the season, there's a lot happening. You know, there are things that happen out of the ordinary. We've seen that happen in 22. You never know, but I think that they really do. They're building on what they've done, right? Versus what some of the other teams are doing, which is kind of a bit of a reset. So I think they definitely have all the advantages baked in, and certainly cannot wait to see what they're doing.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
great. That's great then. All right. So why don't we do this then? Why don't we pivot now to another car launch, right? We had, and so we talked about McLaren. What do we want to talk about next?
Should we have a little look at the Ferrari,
We
the
should.
SF24? Because this is a car that has a lot resting on its shoulders this season. They've not only do they need to build on what they did last year, but they have to build a car that for me certainly it's important, because that essentially is the car that Lewis Hamilton's going to be driving next season.
Completely unbiased now. Come on, let's go.
Make it good, Ferrari. That's all I'm going to say.
SF24, make it good for SF25, right? We should look at you.
But okay, so let's have a little look at the Ferrari. So what were their aims? Okay, so what do they need to do? All right, they first of all needed better drivability. So Charles and Carlos both talked about the fact that actually the car was always on a bit of a knife edge,
Right.
and you were always on the edge of adhesion, and that's at least partly why Charles felt like he was throwing the car off the road in certain races. Miami is the one that really springs to mind last season, and yes, the car was fast, but it was difficult, and I think one of the things that they need to be able to do is take the car a step back, try and maintain the pace, but not make it quite so difficult to drive. The second big thing for me, like the big elephant in the room, is Ferrari were obviously amazing at one lap pace, but they seem to lose that in the races. And there needs to be a way for them to be able to maintain at least some semblance of their qualifying pace in the races. And although they seem to be getting that towards the end of the season, certainly Japan, Abu Dhabi, Vegas was a little bit of an outlier, because I think the track surface was so ungrippy that there was no tire wear there anyway. So that always sort of played to their traits. But you could kind of see that the trend was that they were starting to understand that towards the end of the season. So that is something that they need to build on. And I think we're going to talk about how one of their decisions, at least, I think is sort of plays to that. But you had a look at the car, you had a look at the livery. What did you think?
Yeah, I loved it. It looked great. Shout out to McDonald's, by the way, for adding a little bit of color there. But I think the biggest thing for me is what you just talked about, which is drivability being less peaky, right? Like I think that Ferrari have had this sort of like let's go all in on the concept, right? And it's either been epically great on Saturdays and then epically bad on Sundays, right? And just to kind of bring that down a little bit. And I wouldn't mind seeing a string of consistent, podium places, maybe even, just outside of the podium places, if they are going to be able to build on that car. I think you hit the nail on the head with sort of the correlation between wind tunnel and track. I mean, it was really disappointing, disheartening to hear what the drivers were saying for most of the first half of the season, which is we don't know. We don't know what's going on. Like we have no way of knowing that when we do X, then this happens, and we do Y, then something else happens. And it feels like, and I would add a lot of great caution, as I've told my fellow Tifosi brethren, that you take all of these with a pinch of salt, but it does feel like they have put together a card that does aim to be more drivable. And I think that by itself can pay some dividends and at least help them secure a firm second place, if not, consistently compete with Max and Red Bull. So yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, their trajectory at the end of last season seemed to suggest that they'd got that, and I think that plays into what their car looks like. So just looking at the car and reading what some of the analyses of this car have been, I feel like Ferrari are in a unique position in that they've been very conservative with the way that they've progressed their car. And I think specifically, like the case in point is their rear suspension, right? Which I'm going to come to in a second. But they've moved forward very conservatively, and some of the trends that other teams have now moved towards are what Ferrari have refused to go towards, and they're still sticking with what they have. So they're in a unique position of being very conservative in their own car development, but it's left them in a radical position of being outliers in certain areas. So the rear suspension is a case in point. So they've got what's known as a pushrod front suspension and a pullrod rear suspension, and a lot of the other teams have moved to a pushrod rear suspension. And I'm sure everyone's heard these terms a lot, and over the course of launch season. But I just wanted to just clarify what I think my understanding of what these terms mean. So, quick crash course in Formula One suspension. So Formula One cars are suspended using a double wishbone system. What's a double wishbone? Here it is. This is a plan view of the Ferrari F14. I think this is the 2014 car, and you can see the front suspension, and highlighted in yellow is the wishbone. It looks literally like the wishbone from your Christmas turkey. You've got two of those, one at the top, one at the bottom, and sitting in the middle of those two, highlighted in magenta, is the track rod, and the track rod is what pushes and pulls and defines whether your car has a pull rod or a push rod suspension. So then if we look at the car head on, you can see that in this diagram, the black lines represent the wishbones, and the red line and the blue line represent the track rod. And on the left-hand side is a pull rod suspension, and on the right is a push rod suspension. And what you can see here is that the track rod connects to a rocker, and the rocker connects to a damper. So when the car goes over a bump, or it brakes or it accelerates, the suspension gets pushed down. And when it gets pushed down, the track rod either pulls or it pushes on that rocker, and that rocker then attaches to the damper, which then keeps the car as stable as possible. In terms of what that means for a push rod or a pull rod, the pull rod allows the rocker to be at the base of the car. Okay, so the weight distribution can be placed lower, so you have a lower center of gravity. That's the main advantage of doing a pull rod suspension. But the push rod suspension gives you more space at the bottom of the car to either make the car smaller or place something else there. And shout out to Will Davies who on Twitter is at not only AHA Track. That's NOTONLYAHA Track on Twitter, and the Side Podcast for allowing us to use their diagram for this. I think this is the clearest explanation of how a pull rod and push rod suspension works, and we've added a link in the description below to the website in this diagram, so you can have a look at it. It's brilliant, so definitely have a look at that. And just how does that actually relate to what Ferrari have done? So Ferrari have kept a pull rod suspension, and that's despite everybody else moving towards a push rod rear suspension. And we'll come to why that's been done in other cars later. But for Ferrari, it probably makes sense. Ferrari started to understand their rear tire wear over the course of the second half of the season, and that was in conjunction with their pull rod suspension. So keeping that in play, keeping what they understand makes sense. And I think that's probably why they've done it and why they've stayed conservative in terms of the other things that they've done in their car as well. They want to keep the gains that they've made. Making a radical change to a completely different rear suspension risks losing that. So I think that's why they've left it as it is. In terms of the other things on the car, you could see that air of conservatism was evident elsewhere too. So the side pod system, although they've got this overbite that they've taken from the Red Bull of last season, they've still got quite a big inlet, and that maybe suggests that they're cooling, because that's what the side pod inlet is there for, is to feed cooling air to the radiator and the turbo intercooler, all of those things. Because unlike a road car, they can't use moving cooling parts. It's not allowed. So all of their cooling is done by what is driven through the car, the air that's driven through the car at pace. So they need that. That's why they have big inlets, big outlets to vent that air further down the car. And their inlet was quite big, and that suggests that their cooling systems inside the car maybe aren't quite as robust as what other teams have got. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops over the course of the season. And it may be that what we see now in terms of that inlet and the cooling further down the car isn't what we're going to see further down the season. But at present, it looks quite conservative. So in summary, I think Ferrari have got quite a conservative development, especially in terms of their suspension layout. I think there are good reasons for why they've done that, but it'd be interesting to see how that develops and how their performance develops with that over the course of the season.
Yeah, I think you did such a great job of summarizing the technical aspects of it, but I think it all sort of boils down to having a more stable platform, right? And that seems to be at the core of all of their issues from last year and maybe even the year before. So going for that stability, that aero sort of opportunity, I think it seems like it does also kind of feel like they're attempting to get something in line for 25 and beyond as well. So this might be a continuation of that experimental phase as well. So yeah, that's great. No, that's a really good breakdown of the Ferrari. And so now why don't we move on to the next car? We have a couple more left here. It seems like a good time to transition to your current team, Shez. What do you think about the Mercedes W15?
Yeah, so the W15 I think was the car that I certainly was most anticipating, because Mercedes have been quite vocal in saying that they're coming with a completely different concept for this season, and we didn't really see much evidence of that last year because they were limited by the architecture of their car. They couldn't really change, but there were clear things that both their drivers and the team talked about wanting to change for this season. And I'm going to talk about suspension again in this segment, because that they've come with a completely different car, right? The car that they've brought looks completely different to what it did, what the W13 and W14 looked like. And the 14 was just an evolution of the 13, and it carried over all of the bugbears and the drawbacks that the 13 had. And it meant that the Mercedes were essentially stuck in a holding pattern for a year before they could bring the 15 out. So there's a lot riding on this car. I think we're going to have to talk about what their aims were as well. So the aims for Mercedes were, first of all, to bring a better mechanical platform to allow a more stable aero platform. So those two things go together, right? Aero is king, and it always has been. Ever since wings and ground effect were first discovered as a way to enhance your performance. Aero's always been the main differentiator, but you need a good mechanical platform to allow that to happen, to allow the aero to work, and it's what Mercedes have not had for the past two seasons. And Specifically, the drivers have talked about not really being able to feel the rear end of the car, and there's been a lot of rear end instability, and it's meant that they've not been able to trust the car on both on turn-in. So it means that they've not, both of the drivers, and Lewis, I think specifically, has struggled a little bit in qualifying, especially, to not be able to trust the rear end of the car. And he's talked about that the cockpit's too far forward. I need the cockpit to be moved backwards. And I think that's one of the things that James Allison has talked about doing. But he talked about the rear end instability as a general thing that they need to improve. And we're going to talk about suspension again, because that I think is important here. So they need a more predictable car with probably the center of aero moved backwards to allow the rear end to have a bit more stability, to allow their drivers to have a bit more confidence to throw the car in and trust that the rear end is going to stick. Toto's talked about that stable mechanical platform allowing more downforce to be added to the car, which I think they thought they'd been able to do last season, but they hadn't really. The car was still too unpredictable. When they got to a race, they thought that the car would do X in the race, and it did Y. And I think they need to have a platform that allows them to be more predictable race to race, and they need to continue to have a strong engine. I think the Ferrari was probably the strongest engine towards the end of last season, but Mercedes need to bring that back as well. So how have they done that? I'm going to talk about suspension again. Okay, so what is the point of Formula One suspension? And unlike your road car suspension is just about suspending the car. It's about allowing you to have a good ride, but also being able to pump the car in at speed and allow it to be predictable and not throw you off the road. That's important in a road car, right? But in a Formula One car, the suspension is exposed. You see it on the outside of the car, and air flows over and above it and below it. So it's got, I think, three main roles. One is aero. So because it's exposed, the air needs to flow above and below it, and therefore the aero itself, the suspension itself plays an aerodynamic role. Mm-hmm. Second is that it needs to provide a stable platform for the aero to work, so the suspending part of it also needs to allow the car to stay level and allow the aero to do its job. And that means that in transition points, so when the car is braking, it can't dive too much, and in acceleration, it can't squat too much. And the third thing is that it needs to provide compliance. So it needs to mean that means that the car provides that stable platform for the drivers to feel confident that they can chuck the car in, right? So that's, again, from a suspension point of view, it needs to have enough give to allow the car to dig into the track and do what it needs to do. So there's an aero component to this and a suspending component to this. So what have Mercedes done? I think they've had to switch their focus, because in the pre-ground effect era, they were really, really good at optimizing the overbody aero of the car, and they've now had to switch to the underbody, and they didn't do that very well in the 13 and 14. They seem to think that having that big expansive floor and making the zero pods the focus would allow them to have more downforce, and they chased that peak downforce. But that wasn't really what this was about. This was about having a suspension system that allowed you to have a stable aero platform, that even though that meant that the peak downforce wasn't quite there, it allowed you to have a stable aero platform that meant that the aero was consistent, not peaky, which is what and allowed that aero to perform over a range of ride heights, which is what Red Bull was so good at, but Mercedes absolutely missed. So now we can see that the W15 has changed the suspension at the rear. And as we talked about, where Ferrari have stayed with a pull rod suspension, Mercedes have gone to a pushrod rear suspension. And if you go back to our diagram again, which we'll put up again now, the pushrod suspension here has allowed a bit more space at the bottom of the car, which means that their gearbox is a bit more streamlined and has allowed better airflow to the diffuser, which is the most important part of the car for providing downforce, right? And they've also changed the layout, and they've introduced what we call anti-squat at the rear of the car and anti-dive at the front of the car. So when a Formula One car brakes, it dives. The front end of the car dives down. And that means that the aero center of pressure changes to the front of the car. And Red Bull have been really good at maintaining anti-dive. So they've built in anti-dive into the front suspension, so that dive doesn't happen quite as much, and it means that the aero platform stays stable. Mercedes have done that as well, and you can see that in the way that if you look at their wishbone, their front wishbone, the front arm of the wishbone is high, and the rear arm of the wishbone is low. That's anti-dive, and the converse is evident at the rear, where the rear arm of the wishbone is high and the front arm of the wishbone is low. That's anti-squat. So it means that a Formula One car under acceleration squats as it moves forward. So Mercedes had built in anti-squat to their rear suspension, which similarly allows the car to stay stable under acceleration. So under both braking, you get less dive, and under acceleration, you get less squat. And it means that the car stays level, and it means that the area that the car was designed around stays stable across the transition from braking, mid-corner, and acceleration. And you get consistent downforce, which is what you're looking for. You want consistent downforce. And finally, I think that Mercedes have understood that the mechanical platform, that suspension system, is really important. Is probably as important as the overall aero package, the peak downforce, in allowing you to extract the performance that the aero offers. And we knew this was coming. We talked about what James Allison had said prior to the launch of this car, that the mistake that all of the teams, and Mercedes specifically, had made was that they'd always felt aero was king, peak downforce was king, and the mechanical guys, the suspension guys, would just deal with whatever they were given to make the aero work. But now they've had to understand that the suspension, the mechanical platform, is what allows your aero platform to work. And that's what we're seeing with the Mercedes here. I think the overbody aero, the side pods, and all of that are impressive, and it's fun to speculate on what they've done. The fact that the car now has side pods, great. But actually, all of that is subservient to what they've done with the suspension system, and whether or not they've created the mechanical platform that allows their aero to be consistent and to give their drivers confidence to throw the car in and get performance out of it.
That is a brilliant masterclass in suspension. So my takeaway from everything that you said is much like with Ferrari, right? I think Mercedes are aiming for a more predictable car, a car that can feel good for its drivers, that can behave more or less the way you want it to behave in multiple conditions, multiple turns, multiple bumps, whatever that might be. And I think it does feel like Mercedes have had to eat a little bit of humble pie and go back to sort of listening to what these regulations have been all about. So I think, again, with Ferrari, and I think it's just fascinating that two teams that have struggled have gone slightly different directions in what they're doing, but it seems like it's for the right reason. You sure hope that after 2 years of doing this, they figured it out. It does certainly seem like Mercedes have come back with a car that I think can be a viable sort of second place finisher. It's really hard to see them beating.
It'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to see them beating Red Bull. We don't quite know what McLaren will do, although expectation is they'll be right there. I think it'll be interesting for sure.
So there's one more thing about the Mercedes that we probably need to talk about, and it's
Sure.
that front wing.
Yeah.
So the front wing was interesting, and there've been a lot of conversations about the legality of it, because what they've done is the 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 fourth element of the element of the front wing furthest back towards the rear of the car is big at the outside and very minimal at the inside. And it's something that I think is unique to Mercedes, and it's something that I think brings back an element of the pre-2022 cars that I hoped had gone, but it may bring a big performance to Mercedes. And I just want to do a quick tangent on this because I think that front wing is gonna become a talking point over the course of the season. Quick history lesson. Let's rewind. So 2008 is the last season before the big aero changes. And if you look at a front wing from 2008, and we're going to put in the 2008 McLaren as an example. So here's a quick picture of that. You can see that the front wing is a little bit higher, but it's really scalloped in the middle, right? It was really used as part of the aero for pushing air back to the rear of the car and allowing the aero devices further back to do their job. But it was really scalloped, it was really sculpted, and you can see that a lot of development had gone into that area. If you then fast forward to 2009, there was a big aero shake-up, and as part of that, the powers that be felt that front wing was creating too much turbulence, and they wanted to simplify it. So the rule that came out in 2009 was from the center line of the car, and we've put up another picture here. This is of a 2019 car, but the front wing rules in this regard, at least, were similar. From the center line, which is the y-axis, up to 250 mils lateral to that, so moving outwards, the front wing had to be flat. There couldn't be any aero addenda or anything there, and it had to be very, very specified. But outboard of that, from the outboard 250 millimeters, you could kind of scallop your car, your front wing how you wanted, and it created the Y250 vortex, right? So called because it was the y-axis and 250 millimeters, as you can see on this diagram, out from the center line of the car, and it created a little turbulent vortex that was designed to outwash. So it pushes the air outboard. All of the turbulent air that comes off the front tire, it pushes that horrible, dirty gas outboard. Great. Gives you more downforce. It allows you to control the air going backwards much better. But it means that there's a huge amount of turbulent air going backwards off the back of your car. But what Mercedes have done is this season, if you look at the next little picture of the W15 coming out of the garage, they've tried to, I think, recreate that Y250 to allow the outwashing of the front tire wake out of the car, outside of the car. Okay, so I think they've tried to recreate that. And speaking to a lot of tech people on Twitter and other social media platforms, they don't think that the effect of the Y250 here, or that turbulent, that management of the front wing is going to have the same effect or the same degree of effect that the Y250 has. But I think that's what Mercedes are trying to do. And I want to bookmark this, Ammar, because I'm a bit annoyed. I'm a bit annoyed that that this has happened, because it does go against the spirit of the regulations. And I know the spirit of the regulations are completely pointless, right? That's not a thing. There's the rules, and there's legal, and there's illegal. And if this is legal, great. Mercedes should pursue it. But it does mean that the following car is going to find it a bit harder to follow, and the downforce that the following car loses over the course of this rule set has already reduced. And I do want to bookmark this for a bit later, for another conversation about what the FIA should do in terms of innovations like this that clearly make the following car susceptible and make it harder for the following car to follow the car in front. So kudos to Mercedes for coming up with the idea, and I find it really interesting that they've done it. But a conversation for another date about what that means for what the FIA ban in the coming seasons and whether they should or not.
Nothing like a start of the season with a little bit of controversy. Why not? Why not? I love it. I love it. That was again a brilliant breakdown of everything that Mercedes has done. By far the best from what I have seen. But yeah, how about we do this? We have our fourth car to get to. Let's get to it then. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, let's then move on to Red Bull and the RB20, which from my mind should have just been last year's car with new stickers on it. But you clearly have taken a deeper dive into it. What are your thoughts?
Well, so part of the reason that we delayed bringing out this video was because we wanted to make sure that the RB20 had been released as well, so we could at least give our views on that. And I think for this season, Red Bull, there's two aims here. There's a balance here between evolution and revolution. The RB9 team was all conquering at one race last season. So what do Red Bull really need to do? They just need to keep going, right? But the problem with doing that is that everybody else has seen what you've done and they can start to catch up, and the law of diminishing returns starts to kick in. So actually they need to rebel as well. They need a bit of revolution in their thinking, and maybe this is a bit conspiratorial, but I think they probably did need to deflect a little bit of attention away from what's going on within their team, and maybe that's played into why they've shown as much as they have on their car, and perhaps the spy shots that came out from their shakedown at Silverstone the day before also plays into that too. So they've so just like McLaren, I think were happy that they were shaking down on the same day as Mercedes, so they could hide what was going on there at their launch. Red Bull have been forced a little bit by that. The spy shots that came out from the shakedown there to reveal a bit more of their car, but it does deflect away from what's going on behind the scenes at Red Bull. So I think those are the two aims of the car here, and we know that Adrian Newey talked a lot about evolving the car, and he was a bit worried that just evolving the car might mean that other teams would be able to catch up. But actually, when you look at the car, it looks completely different. What did you think when you saw it?
Yeah, I mean, it does look completely different, and yet again, I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to seeing cars being launched or even at shakedowns and what they actually look like. I think that Red Bull are so well versed with playing the PR game around all of this, is that there's got to be a lot more to it than just the technicalities of this. So I have zero doubt in my mind that they already have something up their sleeve from last year. So I don't know if this is done on purpose to get the rest of us kind of going around in circles, and maybe more importantly, their competitors, right? To just sort of overthink certain things. They certainly find themselves in a position of strength where they can do that, right? They can play these mind games, and we know that Ferrari and Mercedes haven't had to take step backs and maybe even full resets in some cases. So I think it's great. I didn't find anything fairly remarkable from the Red Bull car, but I also didn't expect a whole lot new, right? Like they have been so dominant. I'd just be curious to see what car turns up in Bahrain now, because I just think that they're hiding a lot up their sleeves. I think you hit the nail on the head. For Red Bull going into the season, the game is not so much on the track as it is off track, right? And we're not here to speculate about anything, but I do think there's an impact of what has been happening with Red Bull's car launches, and there's been some interesting decisions being taken behind the scenes. So I find the car to be fascinating. I just don't believe that anyone will come close to beating them this year.
Yeah. And I think actually this car in particular is very, very interesting because from everything that I've seen, everything that I've read, and actually just physically looking at the car, it's they could have just evolved it. You could have had a repeat of the RB19 where they took the wraps off it, and you would have been hard pressed to see the differences between the RB18 and the RB19. This car looks completely different.
It does. It does look different.
Whether what the car ultimately looks like on track bears any resemblance to what this car looks like, I don't know. But and they were clearly hiding a lot of interesting stuff. But it's really interesting to see that where everybody else has started to move towards a Red Bull RB19 style overbody aero, they've moved completely in the other direction. And just to highlight that, we've got a quick picture of last year's launch Mercedes and this year's launch RB20. What is going on? So
it's trolling.
So
that's what it is.
It is, isn't it? I mean, Adrian Newey has just gone, wait a second. You guys have been going on about this zero pod nonsense for 2 seasons. This is how you're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
And just for clarity, Red Bull haven't turned up with a zero pod, but what they have done is at the front of the car they've got a big underbite, right? So they again, like Mercedes last season, have incorporated the side impact structure into the top half of their side pod. So you've got a big overhang. But they've kept the sort of wider side pod, so you've still got a big side pod undercut. It's not a zero pod in the sense that there is a side pod there, but like the Mercedes, it looks like there's a vertical inlet. Now, whether or not that's actually feeding air to the rest of the radiators, or whether it's an S duct being a small inlet that then has an outlet somewhere else. I don't know, and there's been talk about there being 2 separate inlets, and but whatever they are, they look like they're tiny. They've got very small inlets, which is what Mercedes were championing for the past 2 seasons. So interesting. And then they've got these big elephant trunks at the top of the car, and whether or not that's because they've shrink wrapped everything around the radiators and the turbo cooling, and it's meant that you've got a really tiny waist and then a big elephant trunk, a la the Mercedes of last year. I don't know. Or whether this is all completely fake and we're going to see something completely different when the car comes out in Bahrain. Who the hell knows? But it does go to show that actually all of the stuff, the paraphernalia at the top of the car is subservient to what's happening underneath the car.
Mm-hmm.
And the floor is the most important thing. It's the one thing on the Red Bull that we can't see. We can infer things about the floor edge, but we can't because they've hidden it. So we can't see the thing that we needed to be able to see. We can't see the floor edge. You can see even on the picture that we've got shown here, it's blanked out. And from what I hear at the launch, the rear of the car was really well hidden. So whenever anyone wanted to look at the car and take photos, they weren't able to. And there was a wall of people standing at the rear of the car to stop people looking at the diffuser, the most important part of the car. So we can't see clearly what the rear end of the car, the beam wing and the diffuser actually look like. And we're going to have to wait for Bahrain preseason testing to see what that looks like. And it's going to be super interesting when we do. So I think Red Bull played an absolute blinder in that they've shown a car that looks completely different to what it did last year and actually moves in certain ways further towards what Mercedes had been doing. But actually, the really important bits of the car they've hidden and we don't know. So they've deflected they've deflected attention away from what was going on in the background politically at Red Bull by showing this car, but have still hidden the bits that they don't want us to see. Brilliant.
The only thing I love about car launches is the stuff that you just mentioned, like a bunch of people covering the floor, and we're not going to get to see it. And I love this part, right? This is why you got to love Formula One, right? And I think this is my personal opinion. Red Bull have done this basically to misguide everyone. Like they're actually hiding everything underneath the floor. I'd put my money on Adrian Newey having found something in the floor to make their car go even faster, better, all of the above, right? And what they're doing here is they're just showing. I mean, part of this is just that to troll Mercedes, right? Like, hey, we'll show you how to do a zero pod. Like, let's and look, hey, if everything is in the floor as we believe it is, right? It would be amazing to see Red Bull show up with this car in Bahrain and win. And then, I don't know, 2 races later, they bring in last year's concept, if we want to call that, right? And then show up there.
Yeah,
Now they're just like, hey, which car do you want us to use? Like, okay, Checo, you get this one. Max, you get, okay, fine, let's just do it. Hey, while we're at it, we'll even give Visa, Cash App, RB a concept there too. Here you go. Here you take that. And I can't wait for AlphaTauri or WeCarb to be fighting for podiums next year too, because Adrian Newey's run out of space to keep creating and making this even better, like as if there was some way to do that. I think you're spot on with this. I think that given everything that Red Bull has been going through, I think they put this up and they've hidden a lot more than they've shown. I think that's probably the best way to put it. And I think it's all there in the flow.
Smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
Smoke and mirrors, Ammar. I think
all we have to hope for is Checo crashing the car somewhere where we can see the floor again.
See, exactly. And late enough in the season that everybody else can copy something relevant.
They're gonna hit us with more aha moments. Yeah. So we've done a good job of breaking these up. Do you wanna close us out with some closing thoughts?
Well, I thought, what better way to finish this than Ammar? What order do you think these 4 cars are going to finish in at the end of the season?
I have no idea, man. I have no idea. I haven't even given it much thought. And the only thing that I would say for sure is I don't see Red Bull getting beat this year. Like it's just really hard. I mean, stranger things have happened, and stuff's happening, and there's got to be an impact outside. But just looking at what the car is. And it does seem like a dream, right? To drive for anyone, let alone be Max. It's hard to see Max being beaten in any way, shape, or form. But I'm gonna put my head over my heart and say that I think that McLaren will be firmly in the mix with Red Bull, at least earlier on. I don't know what happens with Mercedes and Ferrari, because they just seem like they're so conceptually different than what has been done in the past, and just no way to correlate what's happened in the past. So if I had to pick, I'd go Red Bull, McLaren, I don't know, tied for third between the other two.
Yeah.
What about you?
Okay. I agree with you. I think Red Bull are the only ones that haven't really had to fundamentally change their entire concept, right? They've already got the suspension and they've already got the aero platform that works. So I think they are just trolling, and I think they will have more than enough in hand. And they stopped developing their car at the end of last season. Everything to focus on this car, which is then going to be next year's car too. So I think Red Bull are going to be ahead. But all of the other teams have had logical, although they've come with massive changes, Mercedes especially. I think all of the developments and everything that they've come out with, there have been clear aims that we've talked about and clear reasons for why they've done what they've done. So you'd expect a step forward from all of those teams. Whether that's going to be enough to bridge the gap, I don't think so. But I do think that those 3 teams will be close. And again, if there isn't a big fight with Red Bull, which I hope there will be, there will at least be a really tight battle amongst the following 3. Yeah. I think those are the 3 that will be fighting it out. I think Aston Martin might get in there as well, but I don't have the same confidence in them. Given that, I don't have the same confidence in them that I do in Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren.
I think the wild card in all of this is what happens with Checo and how he drives, right? Because I don't think the drivers' championship is in question. I think you can reasonably expect there to be a battle for the constructors' championship if one of these other teams manages to put, consistent podiums, for example, right? And Checo manages to struggle somehow, some way, doesn't make it to a podium, or as he's had so many DNFs last year. If that comes in the mix, then I think Max can be threatened, right? Because it's hard to see that first place being given up, but I
Yeah.
think everything else is slightly up for grabs there.
I think actually that's really important, and again something ominous, because one of the most interesting quotes I heard in this preseason was Pierre Wash, the head of aero at Red Bull, saying that he thought the RB19 had failed because only one of its drivers was able to extract performance out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And
if one of their aims is to make it predictable and easier for Checo to drive, then well, if they made it a car that both of their drivers can get the most out of, then either we're going to have a great fight for the championship between Checo and Max, or we're just going to have Red Bull locking out more wins than we had last year, which is a pretty horrible thought to close on, isn't it? Give me something. Give us something positive to
We're
close
not
on.
going to close on that. We're gonna hope this is a new year. It's the new dawn of a new season, right? What we're gonna do a breakdown, a season preview at some point here. But I think it's fair to expect there to be a good battle for the constructors championship. Do I think that Red Bull will eventually win? Yeah, probably. But I think it's fair to assume that we would see this going longer in the season than it has in the past. And look, if Checo and Max are battling it out some way, shape, or form, that creates an even more interesting scenario for us. Like we have these other drivers sneak in and get some wins. You have to, step away from the technicalities of the car to recognize that Lewis Hamilton is in his last season. There's going to be a lot happening there. Carlos Sainz is in his last season. He's certainly shown capability in winning races, and if the car seems to suit him in some way, shape, or form, he's going to want to go out on a high. We always tend to sort of overlook George Russell in many ways, but he's trying to establish himself as a leader in the team. So I think that there's a lot to play for, and I think there are enough unknowns here to kind of
Yeah,
keep us
definitely.
interested as well. So I'm looking forward to a cracking 2024 season.
Yeah, let's go. Bahrain. It's preseason. Here we
Let's
come.
go. Here we go. That's another edition of the Tired F1 Pod. Thank you to those of you that have been keeping the conversation going. We love the comments. We love the subscriptions. We love the likes. We love all of it. Thank you for supporting us in our madness here. And thank you for making the conversation even more fun than what we end up doing here as well. We really love all the love and support. So please continue to subscribe, comment, let us know what else what's on your mind, and we'll break it down for you. Thanks again for making the time.